She was 68 years old, and she had become very good at being invisible. It wasn't something she had chosen. It was something that had happened slowly, year after year, until one day she realized that people looked right through her. Store clerks spoke over her head. Young people on the sidewalk walked around her like she was a piece of furniture. When she sat in waiting rooms or stood in lines, no one remembered she was there. Her name was Dorothy, and she had lived her whole life in a small town in Ohio, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, where the same families had been living on the same streets for 3 or 4 generations. She had been born there, married there, raised her children there, and buried her husband there. Now she lived alone in the same little house where she had spent her entire married life. The paint was peeling on the shutters. The garden was smaller than it used to be because her knees couldn't take the bending anymore. But it was home. For 41 years, Dorothy had worked as a janitor at the local elementary school. She had started when her youngest was just a baby, working the early morning shift so she could be home when the kids got off the bus. She mopped the floors. She scrubbed the toilets. She wiped down the desks and emptied the trash cans and cleaned up the messes that children leave behind. It wasn't glamorous work. Nobody ever thanked her for it. But she showed up every single day, even when her back ached and her feet were swollen and all she wanted to do was crawl into bed. She did it because she had to. Because after her husband died in a factory accident when she was only 32 years old, there was no one else. 3 children, a mortgage, bills that never stopped coming. She did what needed to be done. But here's the thing about Dorothy that nobody knew. Here is the secret she carried with her for 50 years, buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. When she was 17 years old, Dorothy had been accepted into one of the finest music conservatories in the country. She had been playing piano since she was 4. By the time she was a teenager, her teachers said she had a gift. They said she could go far. They said she had the kind of talent that only comes along once in a generation. She still remembered the day the acceptance letter arrived. Her mother had cried. Her father, a man who rarely showed emotion, had put his hand on her shoulder and said he was proud. For a few beautiful weeks, Dorothy had allowed herself to dream. She pictured herself on stage in a long black dress, her fingers flying across the keys while hundreds of people listened in silence. She pictured concert halls in New York and Paris and Vienna. She pictured a life filled with music. Then her father got sick, the kind of sick you don't recover from. And her mother needed help with the younger children. And there was no money for tuition, no money for travel, no money for dreams. So Dorothy stayed home. She helped take care of her father until he passed. She helped raise her brothers and sisters. And by the time she had a moment to catch her breath, she was 23 years old and married, with a baby on the way. She never blamed anyone. That wasn't her way. She simply closed the door on that part of her life and moved forward. She sold the piano her parents had bought her when she was 10. She stopped playing. She stopped listening to classical music because it hurt too much. She became a wife and a mother and a janitor, and she told herself that was enough. She told herself that dreams were for young people, for people who didn't have responsibilities, for people who lived different lives than hers. 50 years passed. 50 years. And then one October afternoon, something unexpected happened. Her granddaughter was visiting from Chicago. A bright girl, 23 years old, with a good job and a nice apartment and the kind of future that Dorothy had once imagined for herself. The girl had suggested a trip into the city for the day. Some shopping, some lunch, maybe a walk along the river. Dorothy didn't love the city. The noise overwhelmed her, and the crowds made her nervous. But she didn't get to see her granddaughter very often, so she said yes. They ended up in the lobby of one of those fancy hotels downtown, the kind of place Dorothy had never set foot in before. Everything was marble and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Men and women in expensive clothes walked by, talking on their phones, checking their watches, moving with the kind of purpose that suggested their time was very valuable. Dorothy felt completely out of place. She was wearing the same cardigan she had worn for 15 years. Her shoes were practical, not pretty. Her hair was gray and thin, pulled back in a simple bun. She saw the way people looked at her, or rather, the way they didn't look at her at all. She was invisible again, a ghost passing through a world that had no room for her. But then she saw the piano. It was in the corner of the lobby, roped off with a velvet cord. A grand piano, black and gleaming, the most beautiful instrument Dorothy had ever seen. She stopped walking. Her granddaughter kept going for a few steps before realizing she was alone. Something strange happened inside Dorothy's chest. A feeling she hadn't experienced in so long that she almost didn't recognize it. It was like a door opening in a house that had been locked up for decades. She could smell dust and memory. She could feel the ghost of who she used to be, stirring awake after a long, long sleep. Her fingers tingled. She remembered what it felt like to sit at a piano, to feel the weight of the keys beneath her hands, to create something beautiful out of nothing but air and intention. She remembered the way music used to fill her up, used to make her feel like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her granddaughter came back and stood beside her. "Grandma, you okay?" Dorothy couldn't answer. She just kept staring at the piano. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Her granddaughter said, "Beautiful, yes." But it was more than that. It was a reminder. A reminder of the girl she used to be, the girl who had believed anything was possible, the girl who had dreamed so big they scared her. That girl had been buried under 50 years of hard work and sacrifice and quiet disappointment. But she was still there. Dorothy could feel her now, pressing against the walls of her chest, begging to be let out. People kept walking by. Nobody noticed the old woman standing frozen in front of the piano. Nobody wondered what she was thinking or feeling. Nobody imagined that inside her ordinary body, a war was being fought. A war between the woman she had become and the woman she might have been. Her granddaughter touched her arm gently. "Do you want to sit down? There's a cafe over there." Dorothy shook her head slowly. She couldn't take her eyes off the piano, and somewhere deep inside her, in a place she had forgotten existed, a voice began to whisper. It asked her a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask in half a century. What if? Dorothy stood there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a minute or two. The lobby buzzed with activity around her. Businessmen hurried past with briefcases. A woman in high heels clicked across the marble floor, speaking rapidly into her phone. A group of tourists gathered near the front desk, laughing about something. None of them paid any attention to the old woman frozen in front of the roped-off piano. Her granddaughter was watching her with a curious expression. The girl had never seen her grandmother like this. In all her years of holiday visits and summer vacations, she had known Dorothy as a quiet woman, a practical woman, someone who cooked good meals and kept a tidy house and never complained about anything. She had never seen this look on her grandmother's face, this hunger, this longing. "Grandma," she said softly, "what's wrong?" Dorothy finally blinked and looked away from the piano. She tried to smile, but it came out wrong. Too sad, too heavy. "Nothing, sweetheart. I'm fine. Just got lost in my thoughts for a moment." But she wasn't fine. Something had cracked open inside her, and she didn't know how to close it again. Seeing that piano had awakened something that she had spent 50 years trying to forget. And now that it was awake, it wouldn't let her go. Her granddaughter looked at the piano, then back at her grandmother. She was a smart girl. She had always been observant, even as a child. She noticed things that other people missed. "You play, don't you?" she asked. Dorothy's heart jumped. What makes you say that? The way you're looking at it. Like you know it. Like you miss it. For a long moment, Dorothy didn't say anything. She thought about lying. She thought about brushing off the question and changing the subject, the way she had done 1,000 times before when anyone got too close to the truth. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way her granddaughter was looking at her. Maybe it was the fact that she was 68 years old and tired of keeping secrets. Maybe it was that voice inside her still whispering, still asking what if. I used to, she finally said. A long time ago. Before you were born. Before your mother was born, even. Her granddaughter's eyes widened. I never knew that. You never told me. I never told anyone. It was a different life. A different person. Were you good? Dorothy smiled, and this time it was real. A small smile, touched with sadness, but real. I was very good. I was going to be a concert pianist. I had been accepted to a conservatory. I had big dreams. She paused. But life got in the way. Things happened. I had to make choices. And I chose other things. Her granddaughter was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she looked at the piano again. It sat there, gleaming under the chandeliers, waiting. You should play it, she said. Dorothy almost laughed. Don't be silly. It's roped off. It's for decoration. They don't want people touching it. So what? Who's going to stop you? Some hotel manager? Her granddaughter grinned. Come on, Grandma. When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to? That question hit Dorothy harder than she expected. When was the last time? She couldn't remember. For 50 years, she had done what needed to be done. She had worked. She had raised her children. She had taken care of everyone except herself. She had been responsible and practical and sensible. She had never done anything crazy or spontaneous or just for the joy of it. She looked at the piano again. Her fingers were tingling. She could almost feel the keys beneath them, cool and smooth. She could almost hear the music waiting to pour out of her, music that had been trapped inside for half a century. I can't, she said. I haven't played in over 30 years. I've probably forgotten everything. You don't forget something like that. It's like riding a bicycle. Playing Chopin is not like riding a bicycle. Her granddaughter laughed. How do you know unless you try? Dorothy shook her head. She thought about all the reasons why this was a bad idea. She would embarrass herself. People would stare. Security would come and escort her out. She was too old for this kind of foolishness. She should just go find a nice quiet cafe and have a cup of tea like a normal person her age. But then, something happened. A man walked by, talking loudly on his phone, and he bumped into Dorothy without even noticing. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at her. He just kept walking as if she wasn't there at all. As if she was nothing. And suddenly, Dorothy was angry. Not the quiet, simmering anger she had felt so many times in her life. This was something hotter, something fiercer. She was angry at that man for not seeing her. She was angry at all the people who had looked through her for years, who had treated her like she didn't matter, who had decided she was just another forgettable old woman taking up space. But mostly, she was angry at herself. For giving up. For walking away from her dreams. For spending 50 years pretending that she didn't miss the music, that she didn't still hear it in her head every single night before she fell asleep. She thought about her husband. He had known about her past, about the conservatory, about everything she had given up. And he had always told her the same thing. You should play again, Dorothy. It's not too late. You're never too old to go back to the things you love. She had always dismissed him. She had always said there wasn't time, there wasn't money, there wasn't any point. But now he was gone, and she was 68, and how much time did she really have left? Her granddaughter was still watching her, waiting. Dorothy took a deep breath. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were trembling. Every sensible part of her brain was screaming at her to walk away, to forget this foolishness, to go back to being invisible. But she was so tired of being invisible. Before she could change her mind, Dorothy stepped forward. She reached out and unhooked the velvet rope. The metal clasp made a small clicking sound that seemed impossibly loud in her ears. "Grandma," her granddaughter whispered. But there was excitement in her voice, not worry. Dorothy walked to the piano bench and sat down. The leather was cool beneath her. The keys stretched out in front of her, black and white, exactly as she remembered. She had sat at 1,000 pianos in her life, but never one like this. This was a Steinway Grand, the kind of instrument she had only ever dreamed of playing. It probably cost more than her house. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were shaking so badly she wasn't sure she could control them. She couldn't remember the last time she had been this terrified. From across the lobby, a security guard noticed her. He frowned and started walking in her direction. A few guests glanced over, their expressions ranging from curious to annoyed. One woman actually rolled her eyes. Who was this shabby old woman, touching a piano she had no business touching? Dorothy saw them looking. She saw the judgment in their eyes. And for one terrible moment, she almost stood up and walked away. Almost apologized and retreated back into her safe, invisible life. But then she thought about that 17-year-old girl, the one who used to sit at the piano for hours, lost in the music, dreaming of concert halls. That girl was still inside her somewhere. That girl had been waiting for 50 years for this moment. Dorothy closed her eyes. She took one more breath, and then she began to play. The first notes came out wrong. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy, and the sound that emerged from the piano was hesitant, uncertain. Dorothy felt her face flush with embarrassment. She heard someone nearby let out a small laugh. The security guard was getting closer. In about 10 seconds, this would all be over. He would tap her on the shoulder, ask her politely but firmly to step away from the instrument, and she would shuffle off in shame. Just another foolish old woman who didn't know her place. But then something happened. Her fingers found the keys they had been searching for. The muscle memory that had been sleeping for 30 years suddenly woke up. It was like her hands remembered what her mind had forgotten. They knew where to go, what to do, how to move across the keyboard with a grace that surprised even her. She was playing Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It had been her favorite piece when she was young, the one she had been preparing for her conservatory audition all those years ago. She hadn't played it in over 50 years. She hadn't even listened to it because the memories were too painful. But somehow, impossibly, her fingers remembered every note. The music started soft, gentle, like a whisper in an empty room. The opening melody floated through the lobby, delicate and searching, asking a question that had no easy answer. Dorothy kept her eyes closed. She was afraid that if she opened them, she would see people staring, judging, laughing. She was afraid she would lose her nerve and stop. So she kept playing. And as she played, the music grew stronger. The security guard stopped walking. He was only a few feet away now, close enough to reach out and touch her shoulder. But something made him pause. He stood there, frozen, his hand half raised, listening. The annoyed expression on his face slowly changed into something else. Something like wonder. Around the lobby, people began to notice. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. A businessman lowered his phone and turned toward the sound. A mother picking up her toddler stopped and stood still, the child in her arms going quiet. Even the front desk staff paused what they were doing and looked over. The music swelled and filled the enormous space. It bounced off the marble floors and the high ceilings and the crystal chandeliers. It reached into every corner of the lobby, demanding to be heard. This was not background noise. This was not elevator music. This was something raw and real and achingly beautiful. Dorothy's granddaughter stood a few feet away, her hand pressed over her mouth. Tears were streaming down her face, though she couldn't have explained why. She had never heard her grandmother play. She had never known this side of her existed. And now here she was, this quiet old woman in her worn cardigan, creating sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely. Dorothy was no longer thinking about the people watching. She was no longer thinking about the security guard or the fancy hotel, or any of the reasons why she shouldn't be doing this. She was somewhere else entirely, somewhere deep inside herself, in a room she had locked up and abandoned long ago. She was 17 again. She was sitting at the old upright piano in her parents' living room, practicing for hours while the afternoon light faded outside the window. She could smell her mother's cooking from the kitchen. She could hear her father's voice in the other room, telling her little brothers to keep it down. Their sister was practicing. She was 22, newly married, playing a soft lullaby for her husband on a second-hand piano they had found at a garage sale. He sat beside her on the bench, his arm around her waist, his head resting on her shoulder. They were so young then, so full of hope. They had no idea what was coming. She was 32, alone in the house after the funeral, sitting at that same piano in the dark. She had tried to play, tried to find some comfort in the music that had always been her refuge. But her hands wouldn't cooperate. The notes came out broken and wrong, like her heart. That was the last time she had played. That was the night she closed the piano lid and never opened it again. All of this came flooding back as her fingers moved across the keys. 50 years of memories. 50 years of joy and sorrow and love and loss. It was all there in the music, pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. The piece built toward its climax. The notes came faster now, more urgent, more passionate. Dorothy's hands flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for a woman her age. But she wasn't thinking about her age. She wasn't thinking about her arthritic fingers or her aching back or any of the limitations that time had placed on her body. In this moment, she was ageless. She was timeless. She was exactly who she had always been meant to be. The lobby had gone completely silent except for the music. No one was checking their phones. No one was having conversations. No one was doing anything except standing there, watching this small, gray-haired woman create something extraordinary. A man in an expensive suit had stopped on his way to the elevator. He was a busy person, important, always running from one meeting to the next. He hadn't stood still like this in years. But now he couldn't move. He couldn't look away. There were tears in his eyes, and he didn't even try to hide them. A young woman sat down slowly on a nearby couch, as if her legs had given out. She was thinking about her own grandmother, who had passed away 2 years ago. She was thinking about all the things she had never asked, all the stories she would never hear, all the parts of her grandmother's life that were gone forever. A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered, "who is that lady?" His mother shook her head. "I don't know, baby. I don't know." The music reached its final movement. The melody that had started so softly returned, but now it was transformed. Deeper, richer, full of everything that had come before. Dorothy played the last passages with her whole body, swaying slightly on the bench. Her eyes still closed, her face peaceful. And then, with one final chord, it was over. Silence. Complete and total silence. Dorothy opened her eyes. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. She had been so far away, so deep inside the music, that returning to reality felt like waking from a dream. She looked down at her hands, still resting on the keys, and they were trembling. Then she looked up and saw the crowd. There must have been 50 people standing there. Maybe more. They had gathered from all corners of the lobby, drawn by the music like moths to a flame. They were all looking at her, every single one of them. And on their faces, she saw something she hadn't seen directed at her in years. They saw her. They really saw her. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, fragile and uncertain. And then someone started clapping. It was slow at first, just one pair of hands. Then another joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire lobby erupted into applause. People were cheering. People were crying. Strangers were turning to each other with amazed expressions, asking, "Did you hear that? Did you see that? Who is she?" Dorothy sat frozen on the piano bench, overwhelmed. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to say. Her granddaughter rushed forward and threw her arms around her, sobbing into her shoulder. "Grandma," she kept saying. "Grandma, that was incredible. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Dorothy hugged her back, but she couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight. Her heart was too full. She had been invisible for so long. She had been forgotten, overlooked, dismissed. She had convinced herself that her best days were behind her, that she had nothing left to offer the world. But now, sitting at this piano in this fancy hotel lobby, surrounded by strangers who were still applauding, she realized something. She had been wrong. She had been so wonderfully, beautifully wrong. Dorothy didn't know it yet. But while she was playing, at least a dozen people had pulled out their phones and started recording. That's just what people do now. They see something unusual, something beautiful, something that moves them, and their first instinct is to capture it, to save it, to share it with others. One of those people was a young man who worked at a marketing firm downtown. He had stopped by the hotel to meet a client, and he had been running late, checking his watch every few seconds, already composing excuses in his head. But when he heard the music, he forgot about his meeting. He forgot about everything. He stood there with his phone raised, recording the entire performance from start to finish. That night, after Dorothy had gone back to her granddaughter's apartment, still dazed and overwhelmed by what had happened, the young man uploaded his video to the internet. He didn't think much of it. He just thought it was a nice moment, something worth sharing. He wrote a simple caption. "This woman sat down at a hotel piano and blew everyone away." Nobody knew who she was. He went to bed expecting maybe a few hundred views. People he knew, friends and family. The usual. By the time he woke up the next morning, the video had been viewed 2 million times. Dorothy had no idea. She was sitting in her granddaughter's kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to process what had happened the day before. Her hands were sore. Her fingers ached in a way they hadn't in decades. But it was a good ache, a familiar ache, the kind of soreness that reminded her she had done something real. Her granddaughter came rushing in, her face pale, her phone clutched in her hand. "Grandma," she said. "Grandma, you need to see this." She held out the phone. On the screen was the video. Dorothy watched herself walk to the piano, sit down, and begin to play. She watched the crowd gather. She watched their faces change as they listened. She watched herself, this small, gray-haired woman in a worn cardigan, creating music that silenced an entire room. "It has 2 million views," her granddaughter said. 2 million, Grandma. And it's still going up. Dorothy didn't understand. 2 million people had watched her play? 2 million strangers all over the world had seen her sitting at that piano? It didn't make sense. She was nobody. She was just Dorothy, a retired janitor from Ohio. Why would anyone care about her? But they did care. They cared deeply. By noon, the video had 5 million views. By evening, it had crossed 10 million. News websites started picking up the story. Mystery piano grandma stuns hotel lobby, read one headline. Elderly woman's surprise performance goes viral, said another. People were desperate to know who she was. Where did she come from? How did she learn to play like that? What was her story? Dorothy's granddaughter fielded phone calls all day. Reporters wanted interviews. Television producers wanted to fly Dorothy to their studios. Someone from a famous daytime talk show left 3 voicemails. A journalist from a major newspaper tracked down Dorothy's home address in Ohio and left a note on her door. It was too much. Way too much. Dorothy had spent her entire life avoiding attention, staying in the background, keeping her head down. Now suddenly the whole world wanted to look at her. I don't understand, she kept saying. I just played a song. I don't understand why everyone cares so much. Her granddaughter sat down beside her and took her hand. Grandma, don't you see? It's not just about the music. It's about you. It's about who you are. I'm nobody special. That's exactly why people love it. You look like everyone's grandmother. You look like someone who's lived a real life, who's worked hard, who's been through things. And then you sit down and play like that. And it reminds people that there's more to everyone than what you see on the surface. It gives people hope. Dorothy thought about that. She thought about all the years she had felt invisible. All the times people had looked right through her, assuming they knew everything about her just by glancing at her face. They saw an old woman, a nobody, someone whose best days were long behind her. But they were wrong. Just like she had been wrong about herself. The comments on the video were overwhelming. Thousands and thousands of them, pouring in from every corner of the world. People wrote about how the video had made them cry. They wrote about their own grandmothers, their own abandoned dreams, their own regrets. They wrote about how Dorothy had inspired them to pick up instruments they hadn't touched in years, to go back to hobbies they had given up, to believe that it was never too late. One comment stuck with Dorothy more than any other. It was from a woman who said she was 54 years old and had always wanted to learn to paint. She had told herself she was too old, that she had missed her chance, that there was no point in starting something new at her age. But after watching Dorothy's video, she had gone out and bought a set of paints. If she can do it at 68, the woman wrote, then I can do it at 54. Thank you for showing me that. Dorothy read that comment 3 times. Then she put down the phone and cried. Over the next few days, the attention only grew. The video crossed 20 million views. Dorothy did a few interviews, though she found them exhausting and strange. She wasn't used to talking about herself. She wasn't used to people being interested in what she had to say. But the part that surprised her most was the music. People kept asking her to play again. A local television station invited her to perform on their morning show. A concert hall in the city offered her their stage for an evening. A music school asked if she would come speak to their students about her journey. At first, Dorothy said no to everything. It was too overwhelming, too fast. She had spent 50 years away from the piano, and now suddenly, everyone wanted her to be a performer. She didn't know if she was ready for that. She didn't know if she would ever be ready. But then she got a phone call that changed everything. It was from a woman who ran a non-profit organization. The organization raised money for music education in schools that couldn't afford instruments or teachers. They had seen Dorothy's video, and they had an idea. We want to put on a charity concert, the woman explained. A big one. We want to raise money for kids who love music but don't have access to it. Kids who might have the same gift you have, but who will never get the chance to develop it because their schools can't afford a piano. Dorothy listened quietly. We want you to be the headliner, the woman continued. We want you to play. Your story has touched so many people. If you performed at this concert, We could raise enough money to put instruments in dozens of schools. Maybe hundreds. You could change the lives of thousands of children. Dorothy didn't answer right away. She thought about herself at 17, full of dreams that never came true. She thought about all the kids out there who were just like her, who had music inside them but no way to let it out. She thought about what it would have meant to her back then if someone had given her a chance. She thought about her husband, who had always believed in her. She could almost hear his voice in her ear, gentle and encouraging, the way it had been for all those years. Finally, she spoke. "When is the concert?" 3 months from now. We'll take care of everything. The venue, the promotion, all of it. All you have to do is show up and play. Dorothy closed her eyes. Her heart was pounding. This was crazy. This was absolutely crazy. She was 68 years old. She had been invisible her whole life. She wasn't a performer. She wasn't a star. She was just Dorothy. But maybe that was exactly the point. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll do it." On the other end of the line, the woman let out a sound of pure joy. She started talking about details and logistics, but Dorothy barely heard her. She was too busy thinking about what lay ahead. 3 months. 3 months to prepare. 3 months to become the person she had always been meant to be. She had waited 50 years for this moment. She wasn't going to waste it. The 3 months passed faster than Dorothy could have imagined. Every day, she practiced. She woke up early, before the sun came up, and she sat at the old second-hand keyboard her granddaughter had bought her. It wasn't a real piano. The keys were plastic instead of ivory, and the sound was thin and electronic. But it was enough. It let her remember. It let her prepare. At first, her fingers refused to cooperate. They were stiff and slow, and they ached after just a few minutes of playing. Decades of scrubbing floors and wringing mops had taken their toll. Some mornings, she woke up and her hands hurt so badly she could barely make a fist. She wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. She wondered if she was fooling herself, thinking she could do this at her age. But she kept going. Day after day, week after week. Slowly, her fingers loosened up. The music started coming back to her, not just in her hands, but in her heart. She remembered pieces she hadn't thought about in 50 years. She remembered the feeling of getting lost in a melody, of forgetting where she was and who she was, of becoming nothing but the music itself. Her granddaughter visited every weekend to check on her progress. She would sit on the couch and listen while Dorothy played, and sometimes she would cry. Not sad tears, happy tears. The kind of tears that come when you witness something beautiful and unexpected. "I'm so proud of you, Grandma," she said one evening. "I hope you know that." Dorothy smiled but didn't stop playing. She was working on a new piece now, something she had chosen specifically for the concert. It was a composition by a composer she had loved as a young woman. The piece was called Consolation. It was gentle and hopeful, full of quiet longing and eventual peace. She thought it was perfect for what she wanted to say. The night before the concert, Dorothy couldn't sleep. She lay in bed in her little house in Ohio, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind outside her window. Tomorrow, she would fly to the city. Tomorrow night, she would walk onto a stage in front of hundreds of people, maybe thousands. The concert had sold out in less than a week. People were coming from all over the country to see her play. She thought about running away. She thought about calling the whole thing off, telling everyone she had changed her mind, going back to her quiet, invisible life. No one would blame her. She was 68 years old. She had nothing to prove. But then she thought about those kids, the ones who would benefit from the money raised at this concert. Kids who loved music the way she had loved it, who dreamed of playing the way she had dreamed. Kids who might never get the chance unless someone helped them, She couldn't let them down. She couldn't let herself down. Not again. The next day passed in a blur. The flight, the hotel, the sound check at the concert hall. Dorothy moved through it all in a daze, barely aware of what was happening around her. People kept talking to her, asking her questions, telling her how excited they were. She nodded and smiled and said the right things, but inside she was somewhere else. Inside, she was preparing. An hour before the concert, her granddaughter came to her dressing room. Dorothy was sitting in front of a mirror, wearing a simple black dress she had bought for the occasion. It was the nicest thing she had owned in years. She barely recognized herself. "How are you feeling?" her granddaughter asked. "Terrified," Dorothy admitted. Her granddaughter knelt down beside her and took her hands. "Do you remember what you told me once? When I was scared about my first job interview?" Dorothy shook her head. She didn't remember. "You said that being scared doesn't mean you're weak. It means you care. It means something matters to you." Her granddaughter squeezed her hands. "This matters to you, Grandma. That's why you're scared. And that's exactly why you're going to be amazing." Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. She couldn't cry now. She would ruin her makeup, and some nice young woman had spent an hour doing it for her. "I wish your grandfather was here," she whispered. "He always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." "He is here," her granddaughter said softly. "He's watching. I know he is." 20 minutes later, Dorothy stood backstage, listening to the sound of the crowd. The concert hall was full. Every seat was taken. She could hear the murmur of hundreds of voices, the rustle of programs, the occasional cough. In a few moments, she would walk out there. She would sit down at a grand piano in front of all those people. And she would play. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was racing. She felt like she might faint. A stagehand appeared beside her. "They're ready for you," he said. Dorothy nodded. She took a deep breath. She thought about her husband. She thought about her children and grandchildren. She thought about the 17-year-old girl who had dreamed of this moment and the 68-year-old woman who was finally living it. Then she walked on to the stage. The applause started before she even reached the piano. It rolled toward her like a wave, warm and overwhelming. She looked out at the audience and saw faces. So many faces. Young and old, men and women, people from every walk of life. They were all looking at her. They were all seeing her. She wasn't invisible anymore. Dorothy sat down at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, even more magnificent than the one in the hotel lobby. She placed her fingers on the keys and felt their familiar weight. She closed her eyes. The hall went silent. 1,000 people holding their breath, waiting. And then Dorothy began to play. The music poured out of her like a river breaking through a dam. All the years of silence, all the buried dreams, all the love and loss and hope and heartbreak. It was all there, flowing through her fingers, filling the concert hall with sound. She played for her husband, who had believed in her until his last breath. She played for her children, who had never known this side of their mother. She played for her granddaughter, who had given her the courage to sit down at that hotel piano. She played for the 17-year-old girl she used to be, the one who had dreamed so big and given up so much. And she played for everyone who had ever felt invisible. Everyone who had ever been told they were too old, too ordinary, too late. Everyone who had a song inside them that the world had never heard. When the final note faded away, the silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then the audience erupted. People leaped to their feet. They cheered and clapped and wiped tears from their eyes. The applause went on, wave after wave, until Dorothy thought it might never stop. She sat at the piano, overwhelmed, unable to move. Her granddaughter appeared at the edge of the stage, tears streaming down her face, applauding with everyone else. Later that night, after the concert was over, they told Dorothy how much money had been raised. The number was staggering. Enough to put pianos in 300 schools. Enough to fund music programs for thousands of children. Enough to give kids a chance that Dorothy herself had never gotten. She thought about those children. She thought about the dreams they would chase, the music they would make, the lives they would live. And she realized something that made her heart feel full to bursting. She had been wrong about her life. She had spent 50 years believing that her best days were behind her, that she had missed her chance, that her story was already written. But she was wrong. Her story wasn't over. In some ways, it was just beginning. That night, back in her hotel room, Dorothy sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. She thought about everything that had happened. The hotel lobby, the video, the millions of people who had watched her play, the concert, the children whose lives would be changed because she had found the courage to sit down at a piano one random afternoon. It was strange how life worked. You could spend decades thinking you knew who you were. You could convince yourself that your path was set, that there were no more surprises, no more chapters left to write. And then one small moment could change everything. One decision, one act of courage. She smiled to herself in the darkness. It was never too late. It was never too late to be seen. It was never too late to share what was inside you. It was never too late to become who you were always meant to be. Dorothy had waited 50 years to learn that lesson, but she had learned it, and that made all the difference.